Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into another class guide for Lost Ark Western release. Today we're talking about the Sharpshooter, or as it's known in other regions, the Hawkeye. This is your traditional bow style class that uses a bow and arrow and has a trusty silver hawk or mechanical bird that goes along with it. What this guide will be, as I have guides for all 15 classes that are coming out in the North American and the Western European release, this guide is going to be a short overview of the class, how it functions, what the mechanics are, what the game design is, and generally what you can expect if you were to play a Sharpshooter all the way up to max level and into end game with group content, PvE and PvP. I've been playing all 15 classes on the Russian client to end game so that I can get a sense on what classes I like and all that. So I'm sharing that information with you here today. But first, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Who knows? I might even be streaming right now. So let's jump into it. To start things off, I always like to start with the basic attack. Keep in mind that some classes have minimal use of their basic attack unless they have lower gear or, they have a build that may have gaps in it. But it's good to know the basic attack because I think it adds to the flavor of the class, and it will, in some cases, get used for objectives in PvP or if you're under geared and your gameplay calls for it. So this is the basic attack combo for the Sharpshooter. Say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hit combo. And what's cool about it is it actually does move you backwards while you're doing it. Since the Sharpshooter is mostly a ranged class, he does have some melee abilities, and there are builds that use the melee abilities to great effect, and you'll switch back and forth between melee and ranged. If you use the basic attack, it does give you a little bit of distance as you're moving away, which is nice in solo PvE content when you're juggling monsters or trying to back away. But that is the basic attack. Next, the movement ability is unique per class, and this is the Sharpshooters. It's a relatively long, the cooldowns of movement abilities in the game range from 5 seconds all the way up to 10 seconds. So a 9-second cooldown is on the longer end. It is relatively snappy. It goes a medium distance, further than most, but it does have a longer cooldown for it as well. So, there's not any subtle nuance like the Gun Lancer or the Scrapper that have very technical style movement abilities. It's just, hey, I need to get out or reposition, and there it is. And it does have all super armor, all immunity on it, which is great, and it allows you to kind of move through some things on a relatively reliable cooldown. Next, let's talk about the identity for the Sharpshooter. Every class has one, and the identity is essentially your unique mechanics or your passive that help identify your class as being different from the others. So the identity for the Sharpshooter is Hawkeye, or Silverhawk. So you actually have Silverhawk as your passive. What you'll do is as you attack and deal damage, you'll build up your meter. And when the meter's full, you can summon Silverhawk, which calls in a mechanical companion, the Silverhawk. And then when he's near you, he'll just attack things periodically and deal extra damage, which is great. And when the Falcon is there, he will add a movement speed bonus to you and your allies while he's out. So you fill the meter, you press the button, here comes Silverhawk, and now he's with us. The meter will start to drain down, but you can see that while he's here, he's periodically just dealing damage and attacking. Now, while he's out, so cute, it's a cute little bird. While he's out, you get two options to spend the meter more or consume it completely. The first one is Storm Wings, which is actually very useful. It's low impairment, but this will give you a mouse targeter. And wherever your mouse is, he'll dash down and do this gust of wind in an area, dealing damage to all targets within. And it scales pretty well. It's actually pretty decent damage. Now, the other option is your fast out. So when you use the final attack for Silverhawk, he will dive in the direction of the mouse, deal damage, and then immediately perish. So once we shoot him out, he'll go out, and then he'll be gone, and then you'll have to start building your meter up again because you lost your bird. Now there are, we'll get in class engravings later in the video talking about how this may play into it. And some of the gameplay really is deciding when to bring out Silverhawk, and a lot of builds will have them out most of the time. And then if you're going to be using Final Shot or not to get bonuses or benefits and things like that. Next, let's talk about the two awakening abilities for the Sharpshooter, which are your ultimates, essentially. They have 5-minute cooldown, they use a resource to activate, and you can only have one of them on your bar. So you'll slot one of these two to your awakening slot, and then whether you're in PvP or PvE, you'll be able to use it when you need it for a big burst of damage. The first one is Summon Storm. This one is probably used the most just because it's a little bit safer to use. But when you activate it around all of you, when you press the button, boom, big tornado. It does pretty decent damage overall. And at the end of the skill, you become stealth. So you can see I'm kind of translucent right now. And this does work in PvP. So when you activate it, you can actually go stealth, and then you'll be able to move around targets and deal with them. And actually, the Sharpshooter has some of the longest range in the game. And oftentimes you'll be able to damage people or attack people in PvP from off their camera screen, just because he has such incredible range, especially when he's using things like this, right? He's able to just really just deal damage at a long distance. But if we reset, we can use the second one, which is Messenger of Fenrir. This is a large dog cannon, essentially. And it's one that's used a little bit less. Now we'll see what happens when it comes to North America and Western Europe. There might be some new metas and things like that that come out of it. But this one is a little bit longer because you have to charge it. So when you activate it, you're aiming, then you release, and you summon this giant dog that comes out and shoots. And I think the big thing is, one, you're not getting stealth out of it. This is just pure damage. And it's also a standstill charge, right? I can't move while I'm charging this up, which makes it a little bit more challenging to use. But you can get some really good damage out of it. And there are encounters where it's nice to use this in PvE. And then there might be situations in PvP where you end up using it as well. But I think mostly in PvP, they use the other ultimate. Now, the general gameplay for the Sharpshooter is that of and it depends on your class engraving, but that of someone who sits at max range. In fact, a lot of people will describe a Sharpshooter in PvP as someone who's just sitting off screen, dealing damage, kind of pecking up. They have more of a high DPS throughput. They're not a very bursty class, but they're able to keep high consistent damage out at a regular rate, which is where their true efficacy shines. And then they can stealth, they can reposition, they have some nice staggering and disruption for PvP. And then for PvE, they're a true ranged class. I don't think they have any abilities that have head or back damage, which are positional. I guess they do with the melee attacks, but all of your ranged attacks, I think, are true range in that you can just deal damage regardless of where you're aiming or where you're hitting. You do have some really strong melee attacks like this one here, which is back attack. So you'll get value out of that if you can get behind the target. But for the most part, if you're playing just a pure ranged build or a regular ranger, a regular sharpshooter, you can just deal damage freely as much as you want and get some value out of that. Let's talk about the class engravings, because it is an important system to know about. So what are engravings? Engravings are these things right here. So you'll get these for your endgame customization. There are actually a lot of systems that allow you to control how your character functions and strengthen it in certain ways, but we're not going to get into that in this video. I want to keep it relatively short. The engraving system, it comes from your accessories and your ability stone, and then your 2 engraving slots. All classes have access to these general engravings that all have very different effects, and there's a wide myriad of things that you can combine together, and you'll have multiple engravings that make up your build. However, there are 2 class engravings that each class gets access to. They are unique to that class, so no one else has access to them. And for most of the classes, especially the newer ones, they're polar opposite, and they're usually very build defining. They can control what your build is, what it does, and can make some very significant changes to how your character functions, and then you can build around that once you have the engraving activated. And the first one you have access to is Last Flight, and we talked about this earlier, where Last Flight has a class engraving to modify it. So in this case, this is when you have your Silverhawk out, and then you activate Last Flight, which will send him in and destroy him but deal damage. When you have this engraving, using the Last Flight skill, you will return half the accumulated concentration, which is your meter, and then affected targets take 40% more damage from you for 8 seconds. So excellent for boss battles and raids, because you give yourself a 40% damage amp on a target for 8 seconds, and then you can build your hawk back up, resummon it, do it again. And oftentimes when you're playing with this, you will end up dumping your bird, using all your abilities to get your bar back, get all the damage there, and if you can get it back within time, you can reactivate the damage amp, and you can get this very heavy rhythm of keeping high damage on the target. And I think this is one of the more popular builds just because you can get some disgusting numbers out of it outside of, I think, equalized content. But Last Flight, super interesting. This be the build where you just kind of play off your abilities more. And then usually classes have another class engraving that is the opposite of the first one, right? It's two different polar opposite ways to play. The second class engraving for the Sharpshooter is Second Ally. So the first one is, yo, send my bird out, let him kamikaze, and then I'll get a buff for it, and I'll bring him back and kamikaze again. This one is the opposite. The Sharpshooter summons a second generation Silver Falcon model, V2. The movement speed of the entire squad is increased by an additional 4%. The duration of the call is increased by 60% or 100% at highest level. And then the basic attack is increased by 4 times. The radius is increased. The base attacks and the Whirlwind Blade skill put the mark for death on opponents, which means you still get the damage amp, albeit much less than the Last Flight damage amp. And then you deal more damage to targeted enemies. So it overall just makes your bird, instead of just sending him out for a damage amp, you now keep him around for much longer. He does better. He does more damage. You still get a small damage amp out of that. The party moves a little bit faster, and you're just basically trying to keep uptime on Silverhawk as high as you possibly can, rather than trying to build him up and then spend him for a buff. So it's kind of two different opposite ways to play this, and that's the Sharpshooter. That's going to be it for it. This is how much as I wanted to cover in this video. Obviously, you can go to the skills, you can change the skill trees, we can go to tripods, gems, a lot of different ways to play the character, and we can even go into some of the metas for the other regions. But I think for Western release, this is a great overview for the class, how it works, what you can expect, how it functions, and hopefully it's enough to help you decide whether you're going to main the Sharpshooter or not. So let's close this one out and let's head on to the next class. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.